Okay, hello everyone. It looks like we've got a great crowd in attendance. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. I'm Heather Duncan, the Executive Director of the Mountains and Plains Independent Booksellers Association. And on behalf of the 8 regional independent booksellers associations, as well as PEN America, I'm pleased to welcome you to this conversation about the intersection of bookselling and free expression. I'm going to start with just a couple of housekeeping notes before we begin. First, please read and abide by the event code of conduct that has been posted in the chat. We'll post it a couple more times as well. Also, please remember that there will be an opportunity to join small breakout groups for further discussion of what we're hearing today. The link to hop over to that meeting, which will be a separate Zoom meeting, will be posted in the chat near the end of this session, and we'll post it a couple of times. And finally, if you have questions for our panelists today, please post them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And if you would like to appear on camera to ask your question, please indicate that with your question. The chat, which we hope you'll make good use of, will be open to all, of course, but we're not going to monitor the chat for questions, so please make sure you use the Q&A function for questions. Now, I'll turn it over to Jonathan Friedman, Director of Free Expression and Education for PEN America, who will moderate our conversation today. Jonathan, take it away.
Thanks so much, Heather. Delighted and really honored to be here to help facilitate and moderate this conversation for booksellers across the United States. I just want to start by saying very quickly how we at PEN America come to this conversation. We're an organization of and for writers with a mission to celebrate the written word and to defend the rights that make creative and literary expression possible. And we've been doing this for almost 100 years. Next year is our centenary. We work on these issues both in the US and globally. So we bring to this conversation a view of free expression, not just as something protected by the First Amendment, but as a fundamental human right, universal and inalienable. A core part of our work is to defend writers at risk around the world. That includes cases of novelists, poets, and yes, booksellers who are in prison around the world for their writing and for making a wide range of books and ideas available to their national publics. PEN has also long argued as part of our charter that free expression does not exist in isolation, that we champion free expression and stand against the suppression of free trade in ideas, but that we've also long committed to fighting hate, to standing against mendacious publication and lies and bigotry of all kinds. So we do in our work on college campuses, in schools, and in other kinds of institutions, try to oppose a false dichotomy between free expression on the one hand and values of diversity and inclusion or anti-racism on the other. In other words, we see that it is in fact possible and essential to do both, and that, for example, we cannot fight hate without free speech. So I wanted to just say that quickly at the beginning, that I really do feel there is no social progress without free speech. And even though the concepts and the conversations that we have around that have changed over time, that it remains valuable, and it remains valuable right now as we're watching various threats to free speech around the country. But more than so than that, we value conversation. So I'm delighted to be here with our esteemed panelists today to talk about these issues: free expression, diversity, and inclusion in bookselling. I'm going to ask each panelist to quickly introduce themselves, let us know your names and where you're joining us from, and then we'll proceed to an opening round of remarks for 2 minutes for each of you. Please take it away.
I'm Kenny Brechner of DDG Booksellers in Farmington, Maine. My pronouns are he and him.
Hi, my name is Josh Cook. I'm a bookseller with Porter Square Books in Cambridge. I am he, him, and I am also the author of The Least We Can Do, Free Speech, White Supremacy, and Independent Bookstores, a chapbook put out by Biblioasis. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Luis Correa. I'm the operations manager at Avid Bookshop in Athens, Georgia, and my pronouns are he, him.
My name is Kiese Lehman. I'm a writer and teacher from Jackson, Mississippi, and my pronouns are he, him, his.
Hi, everyone. My name is Summer Lopez. I'm the Senior Director of Free Expression Programs at PEN America. My pronouns are she, her.
Hi, I'm Vicki Titcomb from Titcomb's Bookshop in Massachusetts. She, her.
Hello, everyone. My name is Derek Young, co-owner of Mahogany Books here in the DC area. Pronouns are he, him.
Thank you, everyone, and welcome to everyone in the audience. So let's get started. Our opening question I posed to each of you to give us roughly a 2-minute answer here. What does free expression mean to you, and what do you think it means for the world of bookselling? And we'll go in the same order.
Sure. Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks to all the other panelists and everyone involved. And big shout out to the regionals. I think of free speech as, or at least one of the ways I think about it, is as an inclusive buffet in which all the edible foods of the world are on offer, at least all the First Amendment protected foods. In exchange for not being able to limit or restrict what goes into the buffet, we have the freedom to pick and choose what we contribute or take from it, as well as the freedom to avoid or criticize those foods we consider harmful or distasteful. Free expression is a tool for defending personal liberty whose operation is impersonal and apolitical. It therefore protects our freedom as booksellers and readers to engage in the personal, in morality and political sentiment, in creative and aesthetic expression. Censorship is the reverse of this. It happens when the personal is enforced on the general, when a particular moral or political viewpoint is imposed on others. Speaking of which, one point I've stressed repeatedly this last year while engaged in free speech argumentation is that the political pendulum has always swung back and forth from left to right, and that a progressive rejection of free speech by the bookselling community would be a grave mistake. As we sit here now, there is an absolute avalanche of conservative informed book bans and challenges being directed at school boards and libraries around the country. These challenges have been directed at books whose handling of themes of gender identity and sex and critical race theory are ones many of us treasure. That is the target of this. And to me, there has never been a less opportune time to step back from a support of free expression. Thank you.
Thanks, Kenny. We'll move on to Josh.
Thank you all. To me, the idea of free expression very broadly means as many people as possible can be their true selves without fear. The focus of this group of people will obviously be on people writing their truth and being able to read other people writing their truths. But I think that extends to how we dress, how we look, how we identify, who we love, as well as to personal bodily autonomy. As a bookseller, I see my primary relationship with free expression being focused on using my platform and my advocacy, to whatever extent they are, to raise up those groups that have been and are being marginalized, and to make heard those voices that have and are being silenced and ignored. I think there would be broad agreement with that principle in this group, very generally, and but the challenge and the point of potential conflict comes in figuring out how do we actually bring about that most people possible. And specifically, what should we do about expressions that put other people in danger, make them unsafe, or make them afraid to express their true selves? I know this panel has many different answers to those questions, but I believe the goal is shared. And I'm excited for this conversation because even though we're not really here to come up with answers to these questions, I know I'm going to learn a lot and grow a lot from this conversation. So thank you.
Thanks, Josh. We'll move on to Luis.
In terms of free expression, I'm most interested in disrupting the status quo when it comes to how we think about what we stock in our stores and how as booksellers, we can make the world a better place. The status quo has created an allowance for bigotry and power and has not given the same considerations for the way our choices impact those who are most vulnerable. We need to ask ourselves who has the privilege and power and look to the ways that those who have it have abused their platforms to further hate and violence, and you'll find that there is speech that infringes upon the freedom and liberation of others. It's not contradictory as we said at the introduction, to advocate for harm reduction curation in bookstores, and also want to contest school bans on books that aim to make a better world for BIPOC, trans, queer, and other historically marginalized communities. It's also not contradictory with the beliefs that publishers do not have a moral obligation to publish books by former vice presidents of a xenophobic administration, nor for a bookseller to make a choice not to sell that book. So Kenny, you brought up the pendulum, but when pendulums swing, they oscillate from one side to the other with equal distance from the center point of equilibrium. And at no point in history has the power in this country been shifted away from straight white men for enough to even approach equilibrium. The pendulum has never swung in the direction of liberation and equity fully. So when you sell a book, as I view it, you're not just selling a book. You're providing funding, you're providing pathway, a door. And if we're booksellers because we think that books can change lives, we also need to acknowledge that they can do real harm to the most vulnerable. And for too long, marginalized communities were too afraid to speak, and only recently have some of those communities given themselves the freedom to voice their own opinions. So if we're all saying that freedom of expression is really important, that's not enough. We need to also listen and to make choices to further freedom beyond just speech for everyone.
Thanks, Luis. Moving on to KSA.
Hey, thank y'all for having me. I'm not really sure what free means in anti-Black, patriarchal, market-driven economies. I have no idea actually what free means, so I'm going to try to avoid the question a little bit. But I do know we need more informed sincerity in an anti-Black, patriarchal, market-driven society / economy. One of the reasons I'm not sure how to think or talk about free when we talk about books and book selling and book writing is because books to me are not anywhere near inherently virtuous like products or objects. Reading is not inherently virtuous. Readers are definitely not inherently virtuous. And I think all three of those actually do far more harm than we readers, writers, and booksellers want to admit. Even when we are doing good work, and especially because we often think as writers, readers, and booksellers, we are inherently doing good work. I learned that white people had more interiority than non-white people from white books. I learned that women should be virtuous or villainous, like that binary, from white books. I learned that readers of American books are assumed to be white from white books. These books were gleefully given to me either by booksellers or by librarians who I think would say they had the best interest of me and reading at heart. I'm a writer. I often fail. I often do more than fail. I often do harm when I am sure I am not doing harm. So my hope is that we understand that we are reading, writing, and selling books. If we are reading, writing, and selling books, we are engaging in something that is inherently, among other things, harmful. And so the question to me is like, how do the folks who sell that harm, write that harm, and read that harm perpetually reckon with that? I'm not sure what that has to do with freedom, but I know we need a lot more informed sincerity in the reading and the writing and the selling of books. So thank you.
Thank you. Summer.
Yes, thanks. I want to say a few things I think about sort of some of what John was saying about kind of how PEN America thinks about these issues and how we think about both sides of this argument. You know, we talk a lot sometimes about knowledge institutions as a category that includes bookstores and libraries and that have a critical role in defending and enabling freedom of expression, as well as supporting and advancing diversity and equity and elevating a diversity of voices and stories. And one of the things I think about freedom of expression that we often don't think about is that it of course incorporates the right to freedom of speech, but it also encapsulates the public's right to know. And I think that access to knowledge And that includes the knowledge of the horrible and the shocking, as well as the reassuring and the righteous, is one of the great privileges of living in anything resembling a democracy, right? Knowledge institutions like bookstores, I think, have a special responsibility because our freedom to read is fundamental to ensuring our right to know, even taking into consideration, I think, some of Kiese's really vital points. But I think this is especially true in a moment like the one we're in right now, where efforts to ban books in schools are gaining ground and indeed seem to become a winning electoral strategy for one of our two main political parties. And when legislation barring the teaching of entire areas of thought is passing in states across the country, and in the face of an attack on our democratic principles like that, it is really essential that we shore them up. And this is a radical assault we are seeing on academic freedom, on free speech, and on the freedom to read, teach, and learn. And so in this moment, I think it's more important than ever that booksellers sustain a commitment to providing public access to a wide range of ideas, and that bookstores remain these open doors to knowledge. That does not mean that a bookstore cannot have values, or that a bookseller doesn't have every right to decide what books to carry and what they don't, who to display and who to promote, who to invite to speak at their store. Booksellers make decisions all the time and rightfully curate their inventory to suit the character of a store, their audience, their own interests, and they have free speech too. So booksellers can speak out against bigotry and inequity and injustice and foster constructive conversations on a wide range of issues. They can consciously elevate the voices of those that have long been repressed. They can even critique the books they're carrying or explain why they choose not to carry certain books. But I also think there's some value in some bookstores at least taking a broader approach. And I think it's essential that we be able to defend the right of any bookstore to sell what it wants to, and of any reader to access whatever books and stories they choose. And I think I'll leave it there for now. In the interest of time. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's move on to Vicky.
Hi, I wanted to say it's a pleasure and really an honor to be here today. And honestly, I come here with many more questions about free expression than opinions. And I'm looking forward to the discussion and happy to speak from my perspective. Of course, free expression to me means that, of course, that I can speak without, with the exception of libel or slander, anything I want to. And as a bookseller, it's critically important to me that publishers be able to select the books they want to publish, and that we can choose what we want to sell in our stores. But it's never that simple, is it? And history shows it never has been. And especially when those in power disagree with what is being said and who is saying it. Free expression is so messy to me. It's a very complicated issue. And so I think it's frightening these days to read the news and see facts denied and really harmful and dangerous lies spread, all under the protection of free expression. Social media and self-publishing provide unfiltered, unedited platforms for communicating truths or lies, acceptance or hate. But bookstores are platforms too, and we are in charge of them. What kind of platforms will we be? Whose voices will be heard in our stores? And just as critically, whose will not? Those are decisions we make every single day as we curate our ever-changing collections, as we learn from each other, particularly from other booksellers, and as we provide programs for our communities. And what philosophy and standards do we have that make sense to us for our stores? If we don't stand up for free expression as booksellers, who do we want to regulate what we can read, write, speak, or sell? Who will be the arbiter of what is worthy and what should be banned? How and where do we draw the line for ourselves, and who should do it, or who should do it for us? I'm very proud to be part of the book selling community. It's about as thoughtful and generous a group as I've ever known, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity to learn and share ideas about this critical issue.
Thank you, Vicky. And last, Derek, please.
This is always interesting going last on these things because you have so much to think about and respond to. So my whole statement is out the window. Here's what I know, just speaking truthfully. I'm a bookseller who is Black, right? I have what is called a African-American bookstore. And I was just doing some research, and the interesting thing about how Black bookstores are perceived is that even on Wikipedia, it says that Black bookstores are considered to be radical. in terms of what we sell, what we are aligned to, whether it's the Black Power movement, Pan-Africanism. It's already putting us in a corner where we are not the norm. When what we're talking about, the voices that we're making accessible to our community and to others, are just telling our stories. And that's what I'm here to do every day, is to make sure that my community is heard, that whatever their perspective, whether it's conservative, whether it's liberal, wherever they come from, that they have a book that tells their story, that they can be seen and represented somewhere. So for me, free expression, and I definitely hear you, KSA, where it's everyone's going to disagree about something, but having the ability to speak my truth and not to be banned, not to be told that what I view is radical, but to maybe have a space where we can talk and communicate in the idea of free expression so that we all have agency, that we all feel important, that we all feel empowered. That's what I take my job as an owner of a bookstore, is so people can come into my space, be seen, be heard, and walk out feeling empowered. One last thing I'll note is that I come from Southeast DC, Ward 8, a majority historically Black community. In my area, before I opened up our store there had not been a bookstore for nearly a quarter century. While in all the other wards of Washington, DC, there are between 30 and 40 bookstores. So again, if we're talking about the idea of free expression, how are we using bookstores as an opportunity, like KSA said, not a market-driven strategy of what's profitable, but giving people the opportunity to speak their truth, to tell their truth if they're writers, and to be able to read themselves into a new potential, into a new future. And that's what free expression means for me as a bookseller, that we're making those opportunities available for people and giving them agency to have power over their own life versus having someone else tell them what they can and cannot do.
Thanks, Derek. Okay, themes of empowerment, harm, questions of informed sincerity. Is there anything that anybody said here that anybody wants to react to just off the bat? Kenny, please.
Just a couple of things quick. I wanted to respond quick to Luis's point about the counterpoint about the pendulum, and let the pendulum swing back on that issue. It's true what Luis said, and that's why free expression has been, in the history of it, has been rooted in protecting the speech of the oppressed and the critics of power. From the beginning, from protecting abolitionists to the suffrage movement, to pacifism during the horrible days during the First World War, and the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, to just to the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, sure, yeah, now and again it kicked up to protect the Klan, but 90% of the operation of free expression has been to protect, to protect the oppressed. That's Frederick Douglass stressed that point. He was calling the bomb when it came to free expression. He has so many great quotes. I didn't know which one to choose, but so I wanted to respond to that. And I also wanted to talk for a second about what I think the most difficult question, the most personal, most powerful, and where the rubber really hits the road is on the issue of harm and ideas of safety. I think that's something we all care about deeply. And I think as, someone who reads a lot of YA in middle grade, I think about the heroines in the books wade through seas of harm and trauma. And they fight through it. You get to the other side, glad to be walking in the sun. Maybe this thing with Angela will work out, but even if it doesn't, that's okay too. They emerge on the other side. And when we think about the readers of books being harmed by books, it's almost antithetical to that notion of harm that we find is so integral and and inculcating resilience and part of life experiences. The other aspect of harm that I wanted to put on the table, takes me back to in personal ways as well as historical ways to you think about in the cauldron after the Second World War, and when the existentialists looked at like Simone Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre looked at the inferno of horror and inhumanity and terror that had occurred and just said, there's nothing there. There's no one holding a safety cloth behind us. We make the world ourselves. And, it's my belief that books provide the safe escapes for many children and many people who are in dangerous places, and that we can't know what they find in them. The book, they certainly were a really important escape for me in my own childhood. And I think that there's much greater harm. Harm is addressed. You can't address harm by avoidance, apologizing or appeasing or bullying or suppressing other people, suppressing your way to safety. Harm is best addressed by reading, by conversations, by dialogues like this one, by criticism, by the operation of free speech. And that's something I feel strongly about. Thank you.
Thanks, Kenny. Luis, do you want to respond to any of those points?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that I think about how the First Amendment works, at least for bookstores, is I've heard a lot of bookstores say that they want their stock to reflect their beliefs in the First Amendment. I always find that troubling because I always think that the First Amendment applies to the government first and foremost. And so it's important that the government not infringe on our rights to expression, right? So deciding whether or not to stock something is not necessarily something in regards to First Amendment. But I think where we're meeting, our different philosophies are meeting, is that I really feel like the First Amendment throughout its applications has not been used 90% of the time to defend the oppressed. It's more often than not privilege and power that allows people to skirt the consequences of their harmful speech. And I think that what I'm trying to advocate for is at least trying to tip the balances of power that way. And in regards to how harm operates within a book, I definitely recognize that we can and should reflect some of the worst parts of humanity inside of challenging books that could reflect like sexual violence or racialized violence, but that I think what we really need to focus on is that there's harm that happens through the commerce of these books as well. For example, J.K. Rowling, in her very large platform, has used that money that she's gotten from Harry Potter in order to voice these opinions on trans rights that really are just very harmful, and puts out this very negative portrayal of what it means to be trans and their identities. And that has a chilling effect. Do we at Avid stock Harry Potter? Not actively. If someone does ask for Harry Potter, we will order it. However, a portion of the proceeds we do give to the local gay and queer collective in town. So at least we're trying to balance out that harm. And that's kind of the philosophy that we use here at Avid. While there are certain books that we have talked amongst each other and said, we should not sell these for various reasons, we try to balance that out and see the times where there are some books and some expression that has been harmful and try to mitigate that.
Let's go to Josh on these questions of harm and history.
Yeah, I think this really is where the crux of so much of this discussion is. Personally, my understanding of harm, when I am saying harmful, I am meaning enabling racist policies, enabling transphobic policies, enabling either by raising up the profile of those who seek to enact those policies, or funneling money into them, as Luis has said. That is different from the kind of emotional efforts of difficult literature. And I think that's a very important distinction between the emotional work of hard books, books that hurt to read, and the economic, social, and political impacts of books that enable oppression elsewhere.
Thanks. Summer.
Yeah, thank you. Just a couple of thoughts in response to some of this. I mean, first of all, I think there's no denying that speech does real harm. And I think, some free speech organizations sometimes forget that part of the sentence. And, PEN America tries to be an organization that really acknowledges that as well. And that means you have to try and redress some of that harm at the same time as you defend even speech that can be harmful. And I certainly wouldn't disagree that free speech has not been enjoyed universally or equitably throughout history. And even when it has protected marginalized voices, it has also protected voices that have repressed others. We do a tremendous amount of work right now on online abuse and its impact in particular on writers and journalists. And that's kind of a key example of, language that is legally protected, but often legally protected, but that does significant harm and that infringes on the free expression of others, right? It drives people off of online spaces. It particularly impacts women and people of color and LGBTQ people. And it has that silencing effect. And so, we recognize that as a threat to free expression, even as we recognize that some of that speech is certainly protected. But I think the solution can't be to then come back and constrain other speech that is protected, right? I think we have seen time and again, and we see this in other countries, that often comes back to hurt those that it is intended to help, right? Again, because of where power lies, unfortunately, right? There's a little bit of pragmatism in there. We know that will inevitably be wielded against the most vulnerable. And I think part of what some people are kind of getting at a little bit here is this question of whether selling a book sort of equals its endorsement. And, I think that's a dangerous kind of path to go down. It could quickly leave us with a very limited set of books and ideas available to the public. I think, depending on your bookstore, obviously some people choose to have an inventory that purely reflects sort of their values and morals. Others, again, take a broader approach. And I think, some of both is incredibly valuable to have in our society. I also don't think we can assume that purchasing a book equals endorsement, right? We read books to find out what we think about them, and we can't necessarily assume the intention behind the interest in reading a book and what's going to come out of that. But I also just wanted to acknowledge that I think Luis's example of what you've done with the revenues from selling Harry Potter books is a great example of how a bookstore can kind of balance these tensions, right? So I just wanted to shout that out as well as a really positive example. Thank you.
That example reminded me of a neo-Nazi parade in Germany a few years ago, where the townspeople got together and turned it into a fundraiser. So for every mile that the neo-Nazis marched in town, they would donate money to the group in Germany fighting neo-Nazis as a way to kind of change the power dynamics of the situation. Let's go to Derek and then Kiese.
So this is interesting because I want to throw a little wrench into the conversation here. What we have to remember is that free expression, what we don't talk about, also tells people what is important to them. So, for example, at least in my area, when you walk into a bookstore, less than 2% of the books on their shelves are books written for, by, or about people of the African diaspora. So if we're talking about how we're curating books and what's important to the values and morals of that bookseller, what is being told to myself and to my daughter is that my story doesn't matter. And that's part of free expression that we have to be cognizant of as well. So then it becomes imperative upon a person like myself to say, this story is important and we have to tell these stories. But if a person doesn't have access to my bookstore, when they walk into a bookstore in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where my wife is from, they walk into a bookstore in Tarboro, North Carolina, where my family is from, and they don't see those books on the shelf. They don't see Chancellor Williams or W.B. Du Bois or Kiese Layman. What happens to that person's ability to, again, see themselves in the large story of history? And that's what we're being challenged with right now, is that we're now taking these books out of circulation. We're being told that these books harm other people, while without acknowledging that in doing that, we're erasing someone's voice and someone's representation in history. So we have to make sure that we understand that when we do speak, what we don't say is also important to the conversation as well.
Thanks, Derek. Kiese.
Yeah, I'm really thankful to be learning today with y'all. So I guess I just want to also maybe take it. I don't know if I'm taking it a different place, but maybe go a little. I don't know if deep is the word, but so I think if there was a piece of art or a statement created by and the creators of it were only wealthy, presumed straight, white men, most people I think on this call would be like a generous way to say super suspicious of that creation. One of the reasons that I find this conversation actually like stimulating, but also like angering, is because I do not know why we are giving credence to this thing called the Constitution. People talk about the First Amendment. Who wrote that First Amendment? And this idea that, like, you know what, like, I can't stand Amazon until they offered me a movie deal. I can't stand Amazon until they offered me some other sort of deal. So I think this idea that like one can sell harmful stuff, consume harmful things, but not be in and of themselves harmful is I would like somebody to prove that to me, but I don't think anyone can. So what I'm pushing back against is this notion of, you know, I work for Scribner, which works for Simon & Schuster. And I have a conversation with the head of Simon & Schuster about signing this fool, the vice president, to do a book, right? This head of Simon & Schuster says things to me that prove to me that they have not read many other books other than books written by wealthy land-owning white men, right? So I have to make a decision at that point. Where do I go? Do I leave Simon & Schuster? Do I leave Scribner? No, I stay on that. I stay there because I, you know, intergenerational poverty is real, and I have the ability to make more money partnering with someone I know to be at least one way ethically despicable. What I feel like we do over and over again, y'all, is we all trying to find that little glimmer of innocence. Well, you ain't gonna find that in books. You ain't gonna find that in booksellers. You're not gonna find that in fucking like book readers. We are in and of ourselves part of something that is despicable before the vice president gets involved, after the vice president gets involved. I can't stand these motherfuckers. But we are not virtuous because we love books. The journey that we took as young adults led us to blank, but it also led us to more patriarchy. It also led us to be more colorist. So like, I have a hard time entering these conversations that seem to presume that books and or book reading and or booksellers are in and of themselves like doing something useful. We are not. I know I'm not. The question is, how do we? But I don't think we get there because we're always trying to find the innocence. And it's easy to be innocent compared to fucking horrendous ass Mike Pence. But what damage are we doing with that really sweet YA book that makes gender a binary? Is that it helps somebody? Absolutely. But it also hurts somebody. So I just don't I can't even buy into the terms of the conversation because it seems like we're using the most like wretched white supremacist document to talk about like our hearts, like us. We're implicated. We ain't innocent. And more than innocent, we're harmful. And I wish we could start there as writers, as booksellers, and as readers.
Thanks, KSA. I mean, so interesting and really powerful. I'll say for what one of the things that I'm heavily involved in right now are the school removals around the country, and it echoes something you raised a minute ago, Derek, which is, in most places right now, the two of the books I would say that are being most frequently targeted are Gender Queer by Maya Kobabe and All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson. And you get the sense that it's like, in some circles, that like libraries, schools are teeming with these books. In most districts, we're talking about like, 5,000, 15,000 students, many schools, and one school in one of those, in one school library in that district has one copy of that book. And so the whole country is kind of deciding to remove these books, but it's as though the gains of diversity and representation in these stories, of whose stories we have access to, as though that was, as though that pendulum had swung one way, you get the impression that that's like all the books in libraries, when what we're talking about are just such small incremental gains. And I think that it's really important to make people realize that if you take away Gender Queer in all those school libraries, like that's the book that teen would have read who was looking for themselves. And so I don't know, I do agree with you that I think a lot of it is despicable, but I'm not sure that all of it is despicable, and I think that there's some elements to, I don't know, to empowerment, to change, but it's bleak. Certainly, I don't disagree with that. Kenny, let's go to you.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing more important than our relationship to harm and what we do about it. But the way I see it, it's who's the biggest problem or issue is that it's intrinsically personal and innately subjective, meaning who's watching the Watchmen? How do you determine what is harmful? What standard is there? Suppose you wanted to say Woke Incorporated was a harmful book. Maybe a lot of people might agree. Then moving from that point, what about woke racism? A lot of people might be offended by it, but it's got an author of color and it's more cogently argued. Is that one okay? Moving to Wake Up Little Pookie by Sandra Boynton, which some people might think was a delightful board book, but others might feel was inadvertently coded to poison the minds of toddlers. I mean, who is deciding what is harm? There is no authority for that. It is intrinsically personal. Thinking about it as a bookseller, I have different relationships to different books that I think are harmful. I'm evil when it comes to religion. I don't like organized religion. And when somebody comes into my store and says, "Do you have a children's Bible?" my first thought is like, how could you do that to a child? But I'm in a town with 17 churches. It's a small town. And I say we do carry them, and I suck it up and take them over to the section and so forth. But I do, there are other books, like, Bill O'Reilly's for kids version of Killing the Rising Sun, which he basically argues that it was cool to drop the bomb, that it saved a lot of lives, and to me, that's lying to children. I don't carry that under any circumstances, and I'd even actively try and talk someone out of it if they ask my opinion. But it's completely and intrinsically personal. That's the power of free expression, is that it protects me and gives me the right to apply my sense of harm within my own sphere. And that's true for everyone. If we don't tolerate what we find offensive, and nobody is free in that sense. So that's I think that's always true. As Frederick Douglass said, liberty is meaningless where the right to utter one's thoughts and opinions has ceased to exist. We're not in that place, and we need to stay in that place. And I deeply respect everyone's appreciation of what harm is.
Thanks, Kenny. Let's move to Luis here and Derek, and then I'm going to turn to some of the questions that are coming in the Q&A.
Yeah, I'm I'm with Casey here, thinking about how there's like no ethical consumption under capitalism because we're just steeped in this white supremacist culture. The publishers are like, you're not going to find one publisher that is not in some way started from any time before, like just a few decades ago, that isn't itself the product of white supremacist culture as well. And you're looking at something like PRH, which is has a 70% white writing catalog. Like, that's despicable and needs to change. But in terms of who's deciding, and all these questions that come up when we think about what we're trying to stock in our stores, I think a lot of booksellers, they decide not to do it when they find that there's no right answer, right? There's no clear guidelines, right? But when you're trying to figure out equity, and it's a new concept, right? So it's always changing our understanding of it. And you need to be open to making mistakes and having some curiosity. So sure, my opinions might be changing in a few years in terms of this. But when I lock up the doors at the end of the day, after a day of book selling, I want to think about myself having created some kind of steps towards a better world. So you really need to come from this, not from a mindset of trying to create the most, like, I'm not trying to create a pure bookshelf, a pure, like, I believe in every single word that's written up in our bookstore. No, like, you're going to make mistakes. There are things, blind spots, not blind spots. There are things that you don't know about, and you just need to learn from them and keep going while making steps today that will make the world a better place.
Derek.
So, I love Kiese's energy. I get it. And the thing that it brings me to think of is when I'm thinking of what I do every day. And I really do enjoy hand selling books. That was the thing that put me on this path I am today. Walking into a Black-owned bookstore, seeing myself on the shelves, working for them, and then picking up the book, Revolutionary Suicide by Huey P. Newton. And that first bit of the book, that manifesto, changed my life. And what I found at that point that I wanted to do was to give other people that opportunity. But in order to do that, it's not just about giving any person any book. It's about getting to know that person when they come into your store, developing a relationship with them so that the books that you are offering to them, like Kiese said, I forget the term, was something sincerity, the term you used. But as a bookseller, you have to understand that what you're doing is you're giving somebody something that could ultimately help them or hurt them. And in that process, you have to take the time to get to know that person. What is it that they're looking for? What are their goals? What stimulates them? What do they enjoy in the beginning? Are they open to being challenged on their worldview? These are all questions that we teach our team to ask a person and not just hand them any old book off the shelf, because we have to understand that we are ultimately watering these people, especially if it's a young kid. How are we going to stimulate their interest in the reading? How are we going to grow that? So I just wanted to make sure I said that, because when I look at myself, I feel like I'm doing work to benefit my community. And in doing that, I have to make sure that I'm taking myself out of the picture and not looking at me personally, but how am I ultimately helping the person that's in front of me? How are we adding value to that person? And when we do that, I think that's when the work we are doing is helping people, is of benefit, because they're coming back and they're willing to open their mind and be challenged to learn whatever worldview they have. It's about giving them the ability to have agency over themselves and not be dictated to by someone else.
There was an interesting question here in the Q&A box, which was about, in this idea of I think an open marketplace where you have, many books being published, does anyone have a suggestion for how we can acknowledge the unequal power dynamic between, the stores that want to stock those books and then the rest of the booksellers who might be faced with titles that do them direct harm? So Kiese, we'll go to you. I don't know if you have a response to that question or just the conversation.
I can try to. I was thinking about something Derek said, and actually, I was just thinking about Derek, the human being, and I'm not going to try to essentialize our relationships to books, Derek, you and I, but I think we know what it's like to open a book and be treated like a nigga by a book, right? But by a book. And I'm 47 years old. I've for better, and the part I'm trying to focus on today is for better and for worse. I've spent the majority of my adult life in reading places, libraries, bookstores, blah, blah, blah. And I've never had a librarian or a bookseller come to me and talk to me about their relationship being harmed by the books that they might be tasked with selling me. I think that would go a long way. Also, I just want to talk about, again, we do this thing sometimes where I think there are distinctions to be made between libraries and Amazon and bookstores. As a 19-year-old Black boy in Mississippi, I tried to take out the book Young Badge of Courage from my library that I went to school at. I didn't have my card with me. I slid that book underneath the scanner. I brought that book back the next day. The librarian sent a video of me stealing a book to the school. I got kicked out of school. So I just want to trouble a bit this idea of safety being surrounded by books, but I want to encourage all of us to think about the ways we have either harmed or been harmed by books, and how do we use that? And the question I want to ask is, can we and should we use that to move product? I'm one of these books now that's being banned in these places, and I have a certain feeling about that. But the scariest thing I feel about is whether it's George's book or my book or Morrison's book, we Black people who have read books and learned that we are niggas from books, don't own any of that shit. We don't own any of these places, right? That's not out. So again, I just think there's a lot more complications we could bring into book selling, book sharing. But I would just say, I think it's important for booksellers to talk to the people they're trying to sell and talk to them about how a book might have harmed them and their desire and their need to sell that book to make it. Of course, people ain't gonna do that, but we're on a fucking Zoom talking about ideas. So that's one of just the ideas I had.
Easy to forget, perhaps. There was also a question here in the chat earlier about the different stakes for free expression between libraries and booksellers. Does anybody have a thought about how they think about their work as a bookseller that's distinct or different from libraries on any of these issues?
I can just quickly say that I really don't. I really feel that libraries, especially school libraries, can and should stock many of the books that I might find repugnant and not want to stock at my own store. That's more so a realm for a library. However, I would love to hear more from librarians regarding how they view this topic, but that's how I think about it.
Derek.
I think one of the things that, and we have a great relationship with the libraries in our area. We work closely with DCPL as well as the Prince George's Library system here in our area. But, one thing that we think about critically is the value that that book must bring to a person because they're spending their hard-earned money. Again, we service majority of Black communities, and some of our folk. This is not a luxury item. They're making a choice between this book and something else. So again, how we're working with people, it is about free expression because this book has opportunity to benefit someone. So I need to make sure that the books that we're stocking, the books that we're giving people access to, it adds some type of value to them. Even if I disagree with the premise of the book, so I smirked when you talk about woke racism. The book sold out of my store. He's not a person that I necessarily agree with, but I went ahead and ordered some more. But it's important, and again, maybe it's because of my heritage where I come from, us being told that Black folk are monolithic. It's important for me to make sure people know that we're not. We don't have to think the same. We don't have to have the same ideology. We have our own voice, our own agency. We don't have to be the same. So it's important for me to make sure that a book from the right, as well as a book from the left, can be found in our store so we can have those conversations and figure out what is the right path forward for us as a community, as well as us as individuals.
Vicki, let's go to you.
I just wanted to say, first of all, Casey, I've been very moved by your words. And when I think I'm a white bookseller in a very white community. And it took me a long time to realize that there were so many people who were not seeing themselves in their books, in the books that we were carrying. We've seen an enormous, and this is so enlightening, but over the last few years, our collections have changed so much. And when we have somebody come into our store of color, and this has just happened the other day, where somebody said, "Mommy, this is like me," and it helps me realize some of the power that we have. Conversations like this are so helpful. I can't imagine growing up and finding books not helpful to me as a person, but actually harmful. And harm is one of those things we've been talking about, harm and power. And it's hard to know where harm is caused, as others have said. And Derek, you spoke so eloquently as well on trying to carry, as we do, a wide variety of options to choose from. We want to offer our customers information that hopefully will enlighten their lives. We're all in this, not for the money, we're in this because we are passionate about the power of words. And I do think they have enormous value. And hopefully we're doing a better job in providing the books that are helpful to our community. We've had a lot of discussions with particularly some of our younger booksellers about harm. And, there's some thought of, do we carry a book that is divisive to our community? And my immediate response is, yes, we do. Because what is divisive? These are opening up ideas. Now, of course, we have to use judgments along those lines on whether those ideas are valid to some extent, but I don't want to shy away from the controversy. But thank you again for those really good words.
In our last minute here, just to ask if anybody wanted to add anything on the proactive side. I noted the last question in the Q&A, which was about strategies for balancing bestsellers with books that center marginalized voices, but might not sell as frequently. Just any of you have a kind of closing thought about that? And I do think that is part of, in my mind, how these things can be balanced, like how the diversity of books and free expression can be supported, coupled with a commitment to these kinds of books. Kenny?
For me, that means engagement books, being a passionate reader of them and being able to hand sell, as Derek had so eloquently said. If you just putting them out isn't going to do the job, but if you've read Remote Control or Iron Widow and can talk to it and put it in somebody's hands with passion, and of course you're going to move that book even in a very white area such as Central Maine. So I think the best chance that we have to bring that power into our bookstores is through our own passion for the books and engaging with them directly.
Luis, and then Derek.
I would say you definitely need to look at your shelves and see where the balance is. And there's definitely an imbalance in the bestseller list. And I really do feel like I, as a queer Latino, would be harmed by selling the Mike Pence book, someone who advocates for xenophobia and conversion therapy. That's going to cause me and people like me harm. And I would not want that for anyone else. So you really need to think about how you're going to protect your booksellers the best when you're stocking your books. I do see instances where in conservative areas, some bookstores choose to keep at least one of those books on the shelf in order to protect their booksellers from death threats from people. That's definitely a very valid thing, because they're thinking about their booksellers as part of their own community, and that's really important for harm reduction. But I'm saying we're not going to stock that book. We're not going to sell that book. If someone calls and asks for it, we're going to say, well, I can't get it for you. And whether or not the bookseller chooses to engage in that depends on whether or not they feel comfortable in the conversation to do so. But more often than not, I know that I will be just saying, no, we're not getting it. Can I help you with anything else?
Thanks. And it's such interesting considerations, that I think do reflect the bookstore. We're talking about who the bookseller is. Some great points. I'll just point some folks to in the chat as well about staff and other issues around returns. All right, Derek, final comment. You get to go last.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, what we do is we have a list of core books that we make sure that we focus on. Those books, when we give those books much more time on our shelves than any other books. So whether it's The Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams or The ISIS Papers by Francis Cress Welsing, we know those books aren't going to sell as quickly as a Toni Morrison book or as, Honore Jefferson's new book that came out. We're going to give those books ample time because we feel it's important for someone to essentially to at some point read that book. And if we don't have it on our shelf when someone comes in looking for it, then we're not doing our job. So we try to make sure we have a list of core books that no matter what we have in the store, and if it takes 2 or 3 or 4 months to move the book, it doesn't matter. That's just the cost of doing business because that book is that important for our community to read.
All right. And with that, I want to take a moment to thank our 7 panelists here and all of our sponsoring regional book associations for certainly a stimulating conversation. I think has perhaps not resolved any of these disputes, but at least made possible bringing together some different views of them. I believe there is a link for the breakout rooms coming into the chat for everyone here, booksellers and who are interested in participating in those. And please, just everyone, join me in a round of applause for our panelists here today. Thank you so much for being here.